Hello, I've met a lot of you already, but I was going to start off a little bit about my career. You've already kind of gotten that a bit, but so I apologize if some of this is going to be repetition. But right now I'm a features editor and reporter for Bloomberg News, so I both will write stuff and also try to get other people to write things, write stories that we hope everyone else will find interesting. So I grew up in New Jersey. I went to NYU, and I've basically always worked in journalism, except for, I think, a job at Ben & Jerry's originally in high school. And one of the great things about being a reporter is that you get to constantly learn new things, new subjects, move around. I really was very interested in living abroad because, as Rich said, I first kind of got a taste of living overseas when I was 12, and I did like a program called CTY through Johns Hopkins. Basically, they had a college in Dublin that hosted a bunch of kids who were like ages 12 to 16. And it was very, very structured. You studied. But most of the kids there were Irish, so I got a flavor for what it was like to make friends with non-Americans, live somewhere, and we laughed about all the funny things about the differences in languages and all the things that you probably have been experiencing, I guess, in your summer here. Trying to do all the calculations about the currency in your head and figure out how much an ice cream bar actually costs. So then, one reason I got into journalism because I thought it would take me places. I thought it would be able to live somewhere and work somewhere and like have essentially an excuse to be abroad. And that's finally turned out to be true. As Rich said, I worked in New Jersey and then at the Wall Street Journal, and then I moved over here with the Wall Street Journal to cover the tech industry in London. And then just recently, like a month ago, flipped over to Bloomberg. But one thing that we didn't touch on is the first job I took out of college was at a very, very small paper in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. So that was 2 years of my life that I spent in a place that I never thought I'd live. Growing up in New Jersey, like everyone that you knew were Democrats. People sort of would whisper conservative as if it were like a dirty word. But the situation was completely switched in South Carolina. Republicans were the dominant kind of social and political presence. And I got to really experience life looking through a different lens. So even though I'd lived in Dublin and I'd spent time in Rome, Florence, I studied abroad in Florence, lived in Italy a bunch. That was not as big of a shift, I think, as spending time with other Americans in like a very different social situation. So then after that was like 2006 to 2008. And then I moved back home to New Jersey and lived with my mom for a while. So don't feel at all embarrassed if you move back in with your parents. So I guess what I'm going to talk about today is about the Brexit vote. You guys came in the beginning of July, right? So how many people feel like they know what Brexit was about? A couple, a lot. I don't want to give you guys too much, so apologize if I really do. But I still don't quite have my head around what the EU is and what it does and all the different things it does and all the different ways that it affects people's lives. So don't feel bad if you don't know that, and if you want to Google it, I'm sure there are a lot of explainers about it. But very, very basically, what the UK did was vote to break away from the EU. And what that means is that you have a political effect, and you have an economic effect, and you have a social effect. Politically, essentially, the EU has a bunch of high-level rules and regulations and laws that have over time been incorporated into British law in certain ways. For example, one thing that's often brought up is the regulation of goods, meaning like bananas, for example. That was somehow it was a big topic of conversation before the referendum. And for example, the EU might say bananas that are traded have to be a certain length or a certain curvature. Very, very, very basic stuff about making sure that your goods are in proper condition as you're trading. I'm sure a lot of countries have that, but the way it kind of got spewed in the British press was that the EU has control over your bananas, and that you're only going to be allowed to buy bananas in bunches of 3, which wasn't true. And so there's that kind of legal aspect to it. There's also certain rules about, for example, what companies can do with your personal information. And what will happen in Brussels is they'll set like a basic standard, and then the individual member states can kind of go above and beyond that if they want to better protect their citizens or, change the rules a bit. Then there's also, I'm sorry, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this stuff, but this is my understanding of it. I'm speaking to an actual EU citizen here. But then as far as economically, there's also, of course, the trade situation where for the past 40 years, the UK has basically been under the trade umbrella of the EU. And so when a company wants to sell its goods to France or to, outside of the EU, they don't have to make individual, the UK doesn't have to make individual treaties with, with the US or with France, for example. It'll be covered by like blanket EU treaties. And so now what's happening is the question is, how do you move forward with that? How can you make sure that your local companies are able to sell their goods overseas? That they're not going to get into like a trade war where people are raising taxes or tariffs on goods back and forth. And then socially, the overarching thing to think about is something you might have heard called free movement. Basically what that means is that people can move to other countries and work in other countries, and you don't, in certain parts of the EU, you don't need your passport to show at the border to like go between 2 countries. Northern Ireland and Ireland's a really good example. Right now you don't have to, you can just like, cross the street into the other country. You don't have to show your passport at any sort of border. And the question now after Brexit is, what are they going to do? Are they going to actually set up border checks? Is it going to be that you go into town and people at the Costa or the local coffee shop or whatever, you might notice that they're quite often from Spain or Italy or some other country, Polish maybe, and a lot of the reasons that they're able to come here and work is because of these agreements that the UK had as part of their EU membership. Anyway, so coming up to the vote, most people thought that that people were going to probably just choose to remain as a member of the EU. It was a big shock to a lot of the establishment, and that included, I think, the media, because the polls were showing that things were pretty close coming up to the vote, but the betting markets and the stock market were betting that the UK was going to remain. And so afterwards, after the vote, there was a lot of talk of people, why did this happen? How could this have possibly happened? Why would people vote to throw away all this cooperation and all of the sort of peace, why would people vote to like all of a sudden throw themselves into the unknown? This has really never happened before. I mean, I think like Greenland might have voted to leave what used to be the EU a long time ago, but it wasn't as big of a deal as, a established member of the European Union really voting to leave. And there's no precedent for how this moves forward. The prime minister resigned. So, the question for a while was who's going to actually lead the country through this, and markets pretty much stabilized like after a new prime minister came in. So just kind of thinking back to the newsroom on that day, the morning after Brexit, well, the night before Brexit, who was I telling you? Yeah, I was talking about this earlier, that like we were kind of saying, oh, well, what's going to happen if there is, if they vote to remain, if they vote to leave. People in other parts of the newsroom had like all sorts of plans on here's what we're going to write if, whichever way the vote goes. There were a lot of like coverage plans for each side, whether the decision went one way or the other. But I remember saying to my boss, like, well, I kind of hope that it's remain, just because there'll be a lot less work for all of us tomorrow. Because we had like, there was just the amount of coverage after Brexit, is like exponentially more. There are when things are changing, there are many, many more stories to write. There's many more things to write about, like the unknown versus when things are just staying with the status quo. So immediately after, we were wondering, what happened? Why did people? What was behind people's decision to vote to leave? And there was a lot of talk about how people who voted to leave were racist. They were stupid. They were believing lies. They were believing, they didn't care about the truth. And there was a lot of anger. But one of the reasons I love journalism is because what we're trying to do is go beyond like what people are guessing and what people are thinking, and actually like talk to people and hear them out and hear what they have to say. And I mean, my belief is that, no matter who the person is, they're still obviously a human being. They have probably complex thoughts and reasons and motivations for why they voted one way or another, or they took this action or another. So we went to a town called Port Talbot, and that's in Wales. I went with myself and two videographers, and we tried to talk to people to see. This is a town, just to give you a little bit of context here. This is a town in southern Wales that has a massive steel industry that at one point was massive, but now not so much anymore. And the video that I'm about to show you will give you a little bit of this, but basically everyone in officialdom had told the voters that they should vote to remain. And like the politicians were saying, vote to remain. The bosses at the steel mill, Tata Steel, it's actually an Indian company that owns the mill, they put out a statement that basically said, look, it would be really great if we stayed, but we also understand that there are reasons why you might vote to leave. There's pros and cons, but the majority of their kind of advice was like, it'll be better for us to remain. The union bosses, like the people who were union leaders, were telling the workers, look, it's like definitely better for us to vote remain, and yet still they voted to leave. So yeah, I'm just going to show you a little bit of the video where you'll hear people talking about their decision.
Into this region, and that includes £1.4 billion, and that included things like construction projects, training, and kind of employability projects, and those kinds of things. So it's made a big difference around here. If there's one standout issue that's different from Talbot, it's got to be steel and the state of the steelworks. There's been steel making here since monks were making steel back in the 1200s. They say for every job in the steelworks, there's another 4 that rely on the money from the steelworks, and then the supply chain and things. So that's huge.
All I've ever seen is a decline in the steelworks. That's all I've ever seen. My name's Andrew Clark. I'm from a town called Port Talbot. I've always wanted to work in the steelworks due to my dad working there for 30 odd years. He's been recently made redundant. I voted to leave. One of my biggest decisions was based upon what a lot of the older people have said to me. I'm only 30 years of age. Before my time, we were obviously independent. I think that we can do it again.
Some of the projects that have been funded by the EU, things like the train station, where once it was built, millions of pounds spent on a much needed, actually, local facility, great for business, all of those things.
It's a total waste of money. It looks like something from Star Wars. It's stinking dirty in there. I wouldn't use it. My name is Michelle Coleman. I work at Michael's Cafe in Carmarthen, Talbot. Just waste a lot of money, don't they? They just build and things. There's no good for anything else. All these fancy statues. Children can find no use of using them today. They want to use the park and sit outside, but they can't because it's not up to standard that they can go play. Why can't they spend money on that?
Britain's got the 5th biggest economy in the world, and I'm sure that they've taken knocks before and come back from it. We survived 2 world wars and gone on to great things. I was born and bred in Port Talbot in Margam. I also used to work in the steelworks from 1965 until 7 years ago when I retired. I voted to leave the EU. Immigration was top of our concern. The fact that we couldn't stem immigration from people in the EU and the likelihood of the Middle East people coming here and Afghans and Turks, it was getting out of hand.
People outside of the UK now probably looking at the UK thinking that we are xenophobic or racist and all these things that we're banning about right now. Of course, that's perception, it's not the reality. My name is Darren Nichols. I've lived in this area all my life. I was born in Nice and lots of my family are living in Calvert and Shadow of British Steel. We're a country full of minorities. I'm an openly gay man. I've lived in South Wales for all my life. Again, we're an industrial part of Wales as well, so men are men, you know. I've never ever had a problem with my sexuality here. I've never felt I've had to hide it. Why I would believe first for security, and I believe that the European Union is creating a super state and it's set to dissolve the smaller nation states within Europe. Britain are leaders and have been leaders in the world, and I think this is taking the lead of something that for me is out of control.
It feels quite bleak, I guess, for people that they don't know what's going to happen next, and they don't know what those opportunities might be for them and their children, and what the future might bring.
Okay, so that you were able to understand most of what they were saying. I felt that some of the Welsh accent was a bit strong, but yeah, it was once we got down there, we were able to talk to people. We actually really got kind of to dig into how they really felt like their whole area had been in a long decline. Nothing that had been done so far had really helped them personally in any way. It might have been great for bankers in London, but they didn't sort of, it didn't, they have this example of the train station, and, it's not that pretty, and it's also not like a long-term solution for anything. So anyway, what the sort of part of the thing that struck me here with Brexit was that you had big divisions in places where you normally wouldn't see divisions, where the vote broke down in new ways. So, for example, you would have people in the Labour Party voting both to leave and to remain. Similarly, you had conservatives on both sides. The biggest splits were geographic and demographic. So, like, parents would have voted to leave and their children had voted to remain. And I think you'll see probably a similar split in the States, where you'll have a lot of Democrats or traditional Democrats being attracted to Donald Trump, for example, and then a lot of traditional sort of established Republicans are either second guessing, maybe won't vote for Trump, or just this past week we had a couple of pretty high profile Republicans come out and say that they were going to vote for Hillary. So to me, that's the start of the similarities. I know that the talk was sort of labeled like the UK Brexit and the US election. How are they similar? And so I just made a list of a couple of ways that I thought there were a lot of like similarities between the two. So truth versus fiction versus emotion. Before the Brexit vote, there were a lot of sort of half-truths or untruths being thrown around about on both sides. What's it going to cost to stay? What's it going to cost the nation to leave? How is that money going to be spent? If you do save any money, what is it going to be spent on? What are the pros and cons of being in the EU? There were a lot of even you can like just Google like fact check like Brexit, and there were a lot of myths sort of going onto the front pages of some of the newspapers. And you'll see that in the U.S. election as well. I mean, there are a lot of things that Donald Trump will say. Not so much Hillary Clinton as far as like factual. You can actually fact check this and this is true or false. But Trump will say a lot of things that are just like factually inaccurate. And does that matter to necessarily the voter who is going to vote for him? Oftentimes not. And so why is that? From the people that I've listened to and heard, they sort of feel like, look, you might not be to the letter, like that exact number might not be totally correct, but the direction where we're heading is like the emotion behind what he's saying, or like the fundamental truth that he's kind of speaking about is correct. And that's, I believe that even if you're going to, even if some expert says that like this particular fact isn't exactly accurate, you're missing the larger picture. There's also this sense that there have been like years of decline in some of these, in some towns in the United States. They're still not feeling any sort of recovery. Las Vegas still has a housing market that's in terrible shape. We were talking about Youngstown, Ohio before, where that's another steel town, similar to Port Talbot, but in much worse shape. I mean, there's still like active steelworks there, and there's still a lot of people employed. But in Youngstown and the area around it in Ohio, they actually had a lot of people who were traditionally Democrats switch parties already. They've already seen them voting in the GOP primary, for example. There's a rebellion against elites that I see in both places. Here in the UK, you had like the prime minister saying, let's like vote to remain, vote to remain. A lot of the academics, almost every economist said vote to remain, vote to remain. But people didn't want to hear from experts. They didn't want to hear from elites. They felt like the elites that were running the country hadn't really gotten them anywhere. And similarly, you see that with establishment Republicans and how they are not really full-throated in support of Trump. And also, you see that on the Democratic side as well, with a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters don't feel like they want to support establishment Hillary Clinton. There's a huge immigration question, a huge foreign policy question. Do we allow immigrants in? Do we take care of them? Or is that a security risk? And what do we do about it? And I think underlying all of this is a question about power, because you have people who feel like they're just powerless. People who are, let's say, voting to overturn the establishment view, people who feel like the people in power have done nothing for them. Their vote doesn't really matter. One thing that you didn't see in the video that I found a lot of in Port Talbot was that people who hadn't ever voted, let's say, or hadn't voted in 20 years or something, registered to vote and they voted. Part of that was because the Labour Party had held the local seat, the MP's seat, since 1922. And so even if let's say you didn't agree with it's similar to like in the United States, oftentimes your vote doesn't feel like it counts in your state because maybe, your state's always gone blue or red, or your senator is just guaranteed to win. So they felt like there was no way for them to have their voices heard for so long until this particular vote. One of the big, so they're looking for they want to take power back, and they don't necessarily like know what that means for the future, as they said, but they just didn't like the direction that things have been going for a very long time. and they feel like maybe an unknown is better than what we already know. One big difference I'll point out, though, is that this is, in the UK, it was a national referendum. So every single vote versus every single other vote. And you guys all know how it works in the States with our electoral college, and it's not the popular vote that matters. This is a popular vote. People say that the UK is also much more white than the US. I mean, it's true. There's like about 85%, let's say, white people in the UK versus about 65% white in the US. But, you know, I think that that's a bit of a, I wouldn't like look too much into that number because I think that there's a lot of nuance within just like this big white umbrella that doesn't get captured there. So I'm going to stop talking, and hopefully you guys have some questions. Anything I was unclear on or left out, or
The one thing about Brexit that I guess I'm struggling with understanding is when I think of the United Kingdom, like this is probably just like a Western kind of like perspective of it, and also the fact that I don't really know that much about it. But when I think of the UK, I feel as if like England is kind of like the powerhouse and like makes like a lot of the decisions, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I feel like, you know, places like Wales and Scotland kind of like get like left to just have to like deal with like, whatever decisions are made. And I felt like that might have been like a very big problem, a huge factor with the Brexit thing. Just, you know, people in those other places, Wales and Scotland and things like that, like felt as if like their vote didn't really count, or as if like they weren't really being heard. So like, what are your opinions about that? Do you think that that's kind of what's going on? Right?
yeah, I mean, you're touching on something that's exactly what's going on with a little bit of wrinkle in Scotland. So what you're saying basically is that people who are not in, you say England, but I'll get it even closer. People who are not in London oftentimes feel like, oh, all everyone talks about is London. All everyone talks about is London. And people outside of London feel like they're not being heard, that they don't have any power or control over what happens in London. So that was a big factor. You know, you're voting against, again, the elites. You're voting against the inequality. You're voting against the people who are in power. Now, Scotland voted, so just quickly, in the UK is England, basically England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. There's islands and stuff, but let's not talk about them for a minute. Scotland and England vote. What?
Scotland voted and England didn't vote the same.
Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain. Yeah? Okay. And England and Wales voted to leave. So I haven't really quite wrapped my head around the Northern Ireland bit, but Scotland voted to remain, and what I've understood, what people have told me essentially is that, because when I was in Wales, I was asking them like, well, why is Wales voting to leave while Scotland's voting to remain? If you guys remember, a couple years ago, Scotland had its own referendum to vote to leave the UK generally, and people in Wales said, look, that gave them some semblance of like ownership over their own destiny. Like, we have a bit of power, we have some, you know, control. We have a vote, and it matters. And also, they had through that referendum, they built up a really strong political organization and power base and like identity, I guess. So you know, you're talking about like, it's just Scotland. Yes, they do feel, well, a lot of people there might feel that we're still ignored. We don't have a lot of power, but through that referendum, they actually got some of that power back, both actual power and just sort of like a feeling of independence. I don't know the specifics. You want to speak up about the actual devolvement, the powers that were devolved, but basically they have some more local powers there now that they were basically granted. I don't know about Northern Ireland though. I haven't really figured out why they voted to remain.
That was a big one.